Welcome to episode 28 on the journey to conscious healthcare. This is series 4, episode 2, and is called Exploring the Future of the NDIS, Health and Education. In this podcast, we explore what it takes to consciously create longevity, happiness and fulfillment in your life and that of others. The journey to conscious healthcare looks at the healthcare industry, disability sector, and how to best navigate these areas to get the best for you and your life. I'm your host, Trevor Keen, and I'm the founder and CEO of Conscious Healthcare SA, an expert company that is known for high-quality healthcare services and transforming the healthcare industry in the disability space. Today we go back and venture to the fantastic event that was held on the 19th of October 2022 at Adelaide Oval, where I was personally lucky enough to interview this action-packed panel including NDIS Minister Bill Shorten, world expert in Autism Josephine Babaro, Assistant Minister for Autism Emily Burke. Before we jump into the show, this couldn't go ahead today without the supreme support from Conscious Healthcare SA. Conscious Healthcare SA is now employing. That's right, we're creating ripples and making available more dream roles for practitioners to fulfill on what it is that they do best. Rightio, I'll pass it along now. I hope you enjoy listening to the panel. It was fantastic and I'm sure you'll get plenty of value from it.
I'd now like to welcome Minister Emily Burke, Assistant Minister for Autism, to the stage, along with Dr. Josephine Barbaro, Principal Research Fellow at Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre at the La Trobe University, to join the discussion on stage. So back to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Josephine.
Thank you, and welcome everyone for being here. It's really great to have such a inspirational panel, especially across all different areas here. Very interested in collaboration. What I might start with is, Josephine, in regards to the SACS model. So I might just get you to elaborate a little bit more on the SACS model which you've developed, which is very specific to autism, and how that then plays out and what the impact is from that.
Thanks, Trevor. So back in 2005, when I began my PhD, we saw that there were no appropriate screening tools for autistic children. Essentially, they were inaccurate or they weren't identifying enough autistic children. So I dedicated my PhD to developing this screening tool where we can pick up children as early as 12 months of age. So I trained maternal and child health nurses in Victoria to screen over 20,000 children at 12, 18 and 24 months of age. And we found an accuracy of 81%, and that was the best in the world. Now, the next best tool has an accuracy of 6%. So here in Australia, we've developed the world's best screening tool for autism. And so then I went and developed another tool called SACS Preschool, along with an honours student of mine, so that we could see if we could pick up even more children by preschool, so at 3.5 years of age. And we recently published our results in a journal called JAMA in March. And we monitored over 13,500 children, and we found an accuracy of 83% up to 2 years of age, and we picked up 96% of all autistic children by preschool. Now, early detection and diagnosis revolutionises a person's life. They understand their neurotype early, they have pride in their autistic identity, and they have better outcomes in schooling, in cognition, and in developmental outcomes in life. So really what I want to do is to be able to have this tool rolled out right across the country, and would love it here in South Australia.
Fantastic, Josephine. I might move across to you there, Emily. I don't know if you know too much about the SACS model and what's being done about early screening and how we can then move people that have got autism forward in their lives, getting the supports that they need early enough, and particularly across the different areas. So we're talking health, education and NDIS, because they overlap quite a lot in this area, I'd say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was very excited to come along today for many reasons, but also to have a chat with Josephine, because it is incredible in what you are achieving across Australia and around the world. And it's, you know, we were having a discussion just a little bit earlier about how when Josephine started it, people didn't believe that she was correct in what she was finding, and I think that's an incredible outcome, that you pushed ahead but also have changed people's knowledge along the way about what is possible. So I think it's absolutely worth having these ongoing discussions as we go forward.
Fantastic. And Minister Shorten, I'm not sure if you know too much about the SACS model or your thoughts about early detection and how that all plays in.
Well, when I first got into politics 14 years ago, I was given the portfolio of sort of being the junior minister for disability. I'm not sure in the first 24 hours if it wasn't by the then Prime Minister to make me disappear. But anyway, but it was fantastic. And one of the first places I got to visit was the Olga Tennyson Centre, and I was able to help arrange funding for what they do there. So I'm not as up to date with Josephine's latest research, but my youngest is 12, and she's got a great little mate who's 13, and he was non-verbal. Well, he had a few words, but it was pretty hard. This is about 9 years ago, and I think it was Cheryl DeSanike who was doing work with him at the Olga Tennyson, and he's now year 7, mainstream education. He still gets picked on by other kids at that school, which is shameful, but he changed his life. So I think the principle that Josephine's advancing, other than the sheer pride that Australia's the best in the world at it, is early intervention is just the best use of scarce taxpayer dollars. And the more we can do screening and early intervention. I've seen with Carlos, that's his name, the change it made by being at Olga Tennyson and to getting some of the therapy there. So I'm a believer.
Fantastic. I'll open this one up to the panel in regards to the early childhood approach and what the current state is and how you think that's linking in well with the education system as well.
Yeah, so this is something we have a big policy on in South Australia, as we're very committed in how we can get kids into school earlier and doing a real commission into that. But a lot of it comes back to the support we can give kids earlier on to get that diagnosis, because as we were saying earlier, that early diagnosis is really important to set a child up for life. You don't grow out of autism. This is something you will carry with you throughout life. So if we can find a way of getting that diagnosis to a person earlier and getting those supports to someone earlier, we can start changing those disturbing statistics about more kids with autism are likely to drop out of school by the year 10. You're 8 times more likely to be unemployed in the workforce than someone that doesn't have autism. So we can't change any of these alarming statistics that are happening later in life if we don't find out what's happening earlier in life and what supports we can be providing there. So that is something we are looking at, is how can we get more people that are qualified into our childcare settings, into preschool settings, and have that knowledge about what autism is. Obviously, we have a big policy in regards to primary schools. We would love to roll that out further, but we need to start somewhere. We've decided primary schools is the spot to start. So that's why we have invested that $28 million into releasing a school teacher from every primary school. So what will happen is 445 primary schools in South Australia, public primary schools, will have a new autism inclusion teacher, and they will be someone more than likely already existing within that school community. And they'll be released from the classroom so they can go off and get that training and understanding of what is autism. Because we know a lot of people know the word autism, but that's sometimes where it ends. They don't have the knowledge of what is autism, what can I be doing in my classroom setting, what can I be doing in my school environment. So if we don't provide that knowledge, we can't create change. And we need to start making that change now. We don't have time to wait anymore. This community has waited far too long. My role has come about because of the autistic and autism community through years and years of advocacy. And we could keep pushing the can down the road and say, oh, well, we'll wait until people go through university, or we can wait until people go through TAFE, and we'll wait until people get themselves, skilled in these areas and have this knowledge themselves. Or we could do something really different, and that's what we've done in SA. And I'm really proud that we've stepped in and said we're going to start training our workforce instead. So we're the first place in the entire country that is doing this. It is seen as the dream model, where we are releasing an entire workforce across our primary schools, our entire network, to get that knowledge. And it's a really exciting thing to be doing because, as I said, education is the greatest equaliser. If we start providing this education earlier on, this knowledge early on, we can't change those statistics later in life as well.
Completely agree. It's fantastic to be able to see such a big movement forward and hopefully see other states get adopted with that as well. Josephine, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, for me, it's going way back, really early. A baby is born autistic. They're born with their neurotype. And so if we can identify these babies as early as possible and then get them into a streamlined pathway into the early childhood approach of the NDIS, then we're effectively setting them up to have the best life that they can possibly have. And like I said before, to understand their differences, to find, essentially find their tribe, to explain to parents that autism is not something to be feared or feel shame about, but to understand that if you can provide accommodations for this child, provide the right supports and services for this child early, then we are ensuring the best outcomes for that child, but also saving money as well down the line, because then we are preventing a lifetime of trauma, of bullying, of being othered, of being told that you're disordered and wrong. And then that leads to mental health difficulties, depression, anxiety, suicidality. We can prevent that with early screening. So we really need to be putting funding into early screening, straight into the early childhood approach of the NDIS. And then these children may not require lifelong supports across time. And we found that children that are diagnosed early, that are autistic, 8% of them have an intellectual disability, compared to a quarter of children diagnosed later. So early detection and diagnosis is key. So for me, my passion is to ensure we pick up as many kids as we can as early as possible. And then once they hit the education system, the teachers are already primed and knowledgeable about how to work with those children and how they communicate.
Fantastic. And Mr. Shorten?
Well, first of all, congratulations to Peter Malinauskas and Emily Burke representing the policy, and South Australia is leading the way, I think, in terms of understanding. I think a key point about all of this discussion about autism, the child with autism is not the problem. It's society's ignorance, which is the problem. That's the barrier. And what South Australia is doing, I do think, is leading the nation in that regard. You've also got in South Australia Minister Amanda Rishworth. She's the Minister for Social Services, and obviously, for those of you who know, a very capable person, very capable. And she's working on a national autism strategy. So the thing about the NDIS is it's not all disability, and it's not everyone with a disability. So there's a lot that we can do because we've got a big pool of resources, but it's a whole of government effort. So I know Amanda's working on that. Also, responses to early intervention aren't just NDIS, but I'll come to them in a moment. Big challenge is to make sure that kids can access childcare and that it's quality. You know, we've moved from the notion of preschool childcare from being babysitting, if it ever was, to an analysis that it allows people, primary carers, to be able to participate in the workforce, women. But I think we're finally getting to where it needs to be. I mean, that's a cost issue too, and Federal Labor is rolling out its increased support to help with childcare fees. But we're moving to where it always should be. It's an education issue. And it's about the kids. We've made it about perhaps the economy, which it definitely is, but it's only about the kids' best start in life. So within that as a subset is autism. The NDIS, roughly I think, but don't hold me to the numbers, but for the sake of this conversation, it's funding about 80,000 kids with special supports. That's a subset, and not all of them are children with diagnosis of autism, but a lot are. The view of our early childhood intervention is slightly different to adults with disability. We don't expect that every child we support with a intervention support is going to need the NDIS when they become adults. But there's an opportunity through early intervention support to provide that necessary therapy, and if we know what the barrier is, the learning impairment is, then we can work around it rather than just ignoring it. So there's some of the things that we are doing.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we lead on to another topic there, mental health, for example. So mental health and psychosocial disability, a huge topic, prevalent in autism, but then also across different spheres as well. Just want to know your thoughts on that, because we've got different health, education, and also NDIS. So which remit does it fit with, and how can we collaborate best?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great question. And this is something we also took to the election, is that we would be committing 100 new allied health professionals into our education system, so OTs, psychologists and speech pathologists. Because again, it comes back to, what can we be doing in our schools as a government asset to really be providing that support earlier on in life and making it accessible as possible. So that will be happening in our schools, and obviously there are challenges associated with that, which I'm sure everyone in this room can appreciate, is that we also need more people in these skill sets as well. We need people to be going to university and studying in OT and allied health, because that is a really important career pathway, to be honest. You look at what Bill's doing in the NDIS, what Josephine is doing as well. You can provide the diagnosis, but you need the people there to provide the supports afterwards. So what can we be doing, I guess, in our roles to be getting people into those career pathways? And I think that's a really important discussion we all need to be having, because not only will everyone in this room benefit from that, but the broader community will benefit if we are getting more people into those spaces.
Absolutely. And Josephine?
Yeah, and it just comes back to prevention. Let's prevent mental health difficulties by, identifying and providing supports early in life. So, that's really the biggest thing for me, is we can prevent mental health issues, we can prevent a lifetime of bullying and trauma. Then these individuals will be in our workforces, will be the future OTs, the speechies, the psychologists of the world, and they will be the taxpayers that will also be funding, the NDIS for themselves, their colleagues. So people with disability are taxpayers as well. So, and if we can provide support so that they can get into the workforce and be employed, then that's, obviously the best thing that we can provide for them.
Fantastic. And Bill, often a lot of pressure put on in regards to NDIS and psychosocial disability. Where does the line fit between NDIS and health in regards to that? Because there's a whole conversation here.
When you find the line, let me know. Just to give you some sort of baseline statistics, there's about 59,000 people whose primary diagnosis on the primary disability, I should say, is recorded as psychosocial impairment. That's out of about 550,000 participants. But 59,000 people isn't the sum of all the Australians who deal with episodic mental illness. One of the challenges for the NDIS, and I know Emily won't mind me saying this because I've had this chat with Nat as well, is when we created it, it was meant to be a 50-50 split between the states and the feds. Successive agreements negotiated by my predecessor government have seen the balance of expenditure in the scheme move to about 63% is now paid by federal taxes, and it's only 37% by the states. Now, one level, smart negotiating by the states, but another level, not sustainable long-term, that approach. But more importantly than that is, and I'll get back to mental health, but to understand the environment in which we come up with solutions. The NDIS was never intended to be the only lifeboat in the ocean. So the challenge there is, it's good, we're not related, are we? But thank you for the applause.
You can pay her later.
The point about it is this, and it's not just a state challenge, it's not just a South Australian challenge. But what's happened is that now we have the NDIS, there is a temptation amongst states to say, well, that's an NDIS matter. And, and also within health, federally. So it's within hospitals. I don't even allocate a level of government. I've found out there's one hospital in Australia used to put a very small number of children are born without one eye. And the hospital used to put in the eyeball, cosmetic, but, they've stopped doing it. They said that's an NDIS matter. And I think, oh, my Lord. So that's the point about when I was being half in jest but half serious. Where do you draw the line? What's a health matter? What's an NDIS matter? I think the collective challenge, not just a state government, not just health department, not just NDIS, and not just government, is how do we fund community mental health? Part of that challenge is, of course, mental illness can be episodic in nature. Now, if it's a disaster and you can be triaged in hospital in the in the emergency ward for a day or two, but there's not enough in between an NDIS or hospital treatment. And there's families dealing with it, individuals dealing with it. So Medicare can help a bit, and we can do things. Built on top of that is this sort of shortage in workforce, as was been said by other speakers. It's an interesting problem to have, but because we properly fund the NDIS, I mean, when I started, there was no NDIS. Just think, 10 years ago, this did not exist. But what it's seen, and by paying it well, is it's dragged resources out of aged care, for example. On top of that, we've had COVID, so there's more mental health trauma out there than I think, than we fully acknowledge. Then we've had our borders shut, and so we haven't had the same contribution of skilled migration. Then we've had cutbacks at universities and TAFEs federally, so there's a lot of pressure, and we have a skills shortage which affects a range of industries. On top of that, we have the constant battle in government budgets, so that's why I'm so impressed by South Australia having the autism approach it's got, is that we have to have a discussion about effective models of community health intervention, and they already exist, but fund them properly. The other little final thing I'll say is we fund so many things as pilot programs. We actually know what works. Calling it a pilot may be a nice bit of budget, it's not ongoing, it doesn't look like we're spending too much, 2, 3, 4 years' time. But that makes it hard for the workforce to feel a sense of continuity. Going back to that earlier issue I mentioned, we've got to give people who want to do the right thing, we shouldn't exploit their emotional value system and not pay them properly and give them certainty in their employment careers.
Thanks for that. I want to open up in regards to whether it be accessing onto the NDIS or whether it be plan reviews. We've currently got an approach which is a deficit-based model as opposed to strength-based. Is there any sort of thoughts about how we can change that so we can really empower people and individuals, as opposed to at the moment you have to really talk about your worst day? Your worst day is often talked about. What's your worst day with autism, Parkinson's? Doesn't matter what it is, but is there any thoughts on changing that so it's a bit more inclusive and empowering individuals?
Should I kick off as an NDIS planner? I mean, I welcome the free opinions of the others. You're quite right. If you were building a house, you wouldn't say to a builder, or you'd say to a builder, right, here's $700,000 or $1 million, build me my house. What you wouldn't say to the builder is, you're going to get $100 an hour for every hour you spend building my house and send me the bill at the end. Do you see what I'm getting at? We measure by volume of activity, or we pay by volume of activity. Now, some functions you have to pay by volume of activity. But I think we need to have a discussion in the NDIS, and that moves beyond the deficit then approach. What's the outcome that we're looking for? And then reward the outcome and fund to the outcome as opposed to every ingredient. Now, these are very early days, and maybe that's too hard. Maybe we're just going to pay by volume of service and that's it. Maybe that's the easiest way to price services, but I'm not convinced. So anyway, this review we're having, so that's one way to get beyond the deficit model. We've got to start looking at what are the outcomes that we want for people rather than just every individual cost. In other words, what's the value of the plan as opposed to the price of each individual ingredient? Now, I don't think I'm being a dreamer there. I'm not saying that's... I don't think that's an unrealistic sort of priority. The scheme is an individual scheme about how people live in community. It's not about particular, leave aside early childhood intervention, but it's not about particular inputs. It's about what's the outcome. So I think that's part of the challenge. I also think a lot of people on the NDIS often tell me, well, not the happy ones, you never hear from happy people in our job, occasionally, but not often. If you do, Emily, send them my way.
I'll keep looking.
Yeah, we'll keep looking for them. But quite legitimately, people are unhappy say that they have a good planning meeting and then they get the plan. And they often think they got someone else's plan. So I think the more time we spend in the pre-planning and the planning bit, then the less wonky everything else becomes after that. So they're just a couple of ideas, but there's plenty more, I know.
Fantastic, Josephine.
Look, I think if we move away from, for example, I'll talk about autism because obviously that's my specialty. In our manual, there are different levels of support for autism, level 1, 2 and 3. Now, in the manual, it says explicitly, Levels are not to be used to determine funding or to determine support. And in the NDIS, there is unfortunately this pattern whereby if you are diagnosed autistic level 1, then likely not to get funding, even though it's not supposed to be linked to levels. And so if we really look at the functional capacity or functional impairments of an individual and not looking at levels, for example, and focusing on the strengths of that individual, that's really the only way that we're going to move past that. What is your worst day? It's what can we do to make your day-to-day life better, and what are some of your strengths and how can we work to those strengths?
Fantastic.
I think both Bill and Josephine said something very common there, is that it's about outcomes. Quite often it's really easy for us to focus on, what do you find really hard, but that's not providing, what needs to actually change. So with all, the language is really, really important, and this is what we're finding when we're pulling together what our autism strategy will look like in South Australia. So we've never had a strategy before in South Australia. It's something that we're pulling together at the moment. Discussion paper is in consultation right now with the autistic community, and it's going to be co-designed because it is the language that's in there about not focusing on what could be seen as challenges or barriers, but where do we need to go? What do we need to be doing so that we can have those outcomes? We can have, what needs to change in our workplaces so that we can have more people employed. So I think, it's a shift in language of, we know we need to know what the challenges are, correct. But more importantly, we need to know where we're going and what the outcomes are going to be from that, those conversations. So I think that language change is really important to have.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And then in regards to, we've got a situation, say someone with autism might have behaviours of concerns and then end up getting kicked out of school. Where does that fit in as far as a education problem versus an NDIS problem? Because we've often had, and there's a few in the crowd here today that have parents and they have that situation, and then ultimately there's not funding through the NDIS for that to occur. The child is in school. How can we sort of make sure that we've got a net so that people don't fall through? They're obviously missing working and other opportunities from that. So any thoughts on that?
This is something I'm very passionate about. So I hear this story far too often, and I find it very disturbing that a kid doesn't have the absolute right to be in the classroom, and that's what we're here to do. We're here to try and change that outcome, and it comes back a lot to a lot of people in our school communities not having that knowledge. So I'm sorry to keep coming back to it, but it is the importance of starting that process of bringing that new skill set into our schools by establishing the autism inclusion teacher, because we are just finding that within a school community there isn't enough understanding and knowledge about what autism is and what you can be doing to really change that culture in a school. So I had I've had many parents tell me these stories, but a mum, Paula, come in and have a chat with me and say that her son is being homeschooled now. And the reason why he's been homeschooled is because when he started school, in reception, obviously, he liked trains. He's autistic and he loves trains. So to get him engaged in the classroom, the teacher would often give him trains to help him engage. But as time went on, he started to get excluded from the classroom and was walked up to the first aid room and was told, you can sit there on your own or your mum can come pick you up from school. Ended up being mum would always come and pick him up from school. So mum works at Flinders Medical Centre, she's a nurse, and during the pandemic she loses her job because it got to a point where she couldn't keep going and picking up her son, and work wasn't being understanding of that anymore. It just was too regular. And the reason why her little boy continued to be excluded is because he wasn't engaging in the classroom. And she couldn't understand why he wasn't engaging in the classroom. He was, more than happy to, but the teacher wasn't finding a way to engage him. And she said to the teacher, what have you been doing? And the teacher said, well, he likes trains, so we've just let him watch Thomas the Tank Engine. Now, this isn't a reception student we're talking about anymore. This isn't a year 2 student we're talking about anymore. This is a year 5 student. No year 5 student is wanting to watch Thomas the Tank Engine, but because when they started at school, they were told that this child liked trains, they thought that, well, the rest of his life he can watch Thomas the Tank Engine at school. Now, that's not okay. That kid is now being taught at home and being removed from the school system. And we have to really do something about bringing that knowledge to our teachers so that, you know, kids like Nash can stay at school and not be made to have homeschool, you know, if that's their choice to be in the school system. So I really think it comes back to what can we be doing, and I think it really does start with building that knowledge. And just to expand on what that is going to look like, that training program, it is providing access, direct access to allied health professionals to our teachers. So when we're having these times away from the classroom, that autism inclusion teacher will be able to have Zoom meetings with allied health professionals in a network. So their local school network, which usually consists of about 10 schools, will all come onto that Zoom network and be able to ask OTs, speech pathologists and psychologists, what could I be doing to support my school? Another teacher asked me if I could ask you this question. What's your suggestions for, you know, changing our school culture? So they'll have that direct access to those allied health professionals. But the really important thing is once that meeting's over, they'll also know who the autism inclusion teacher is up the road at the neighbouring school. So they'll be able to ring them up and say, hey, I really liked what you were doing at the school. I want to come and check that out, and I'm going to use some of my time to do that I've got put aside for this role. So we're really increasing the size of that network so that people can keep expanding their knowledge. So I think that's a really important way to start.
That's fantastic. Education's obviously the key to getting things rolling there.
Yeah.
Josephine?
Yeah, I just want to emphasise, I think it's so fantastic and really exciting, Emily, about, you know, upskilling teachers and providing allied health services within the education system, because we need our professionals, our teachers, to really fully understand that if a kid can do better, they will do better. And so if you provide the appropriate accommodations for that child, you understand the way that that child learns, you understand that they may, for example, need to be walking at the back of the classroom, they may need fidget toys, they may need to have different things from their peers, that it's not about them having something special, it's that they require that to learn to the best of their capacity. So if we do have our teachers understand that and we have our allied health professionals coming into the schools, then it will really help these children to be understood and to learn.
Fantastic. And Bill, you're often getting told to foot the bill for it in regards to NDIS about this. What's your thoughts on the collaboration between that and the education sector in this space?
I was very impressed by Emily's answer then, and I think other states need to hear what you're doing. My first politician's experience with autism is I met a really great mum called Julie early on when I was the junior minister. And she got me to meet another group of, they were mainly mums, but because as we know, a child with disability can be one of the pressures in marriages breaking up. You know, it's tough. But she said something to me which has stayed with me ever since. She said, I've got 2 little boys, they're great, but if they're at the supermarket and they're acting out, she said, I've had other people say you're a bad mum because you can't control your kids. And that's very hurtful. But what it also reminds me of is just ignorance. There's a few mean Australians, but I think most Australians are pretty warm-hearted. But sometimes we don't know what we don't know. So I think the positive representation of people with autism, but people with disability, is crucial. You know, GPs, I know the experience talking to parents with kids with autism. Just because you're a GP doesn't make you a disability expert. Makes you probably quite a nice person, but doesn't make you a disability expert. And, you know, getting needles out for injections, and some kids will react. So I think it's not just teachers in South Australia who need to get some familiarity. I think they should be teaching some lived experience of disability in all the medical schools in Australia, for example. I think our media should be putting more people with disability in their ads and in their characters in the TV shows. One thing I liked about Neighbours is they had actors with disability who were in the show. So I think the only thing I'd add to the wisdom that we've already heard from the other speakers is we've got to we can never assume that people know, and we've got to get people information. You know, I've been to plenty of seminars when, say, there's an expert in Josephine's area talk about autism, the hundreds of cars in the traffic jam, to listen to a speaker, to try and give parents some skills to understand and know more. And so I think the more information we can put out there, it'll have an exponential benefit.
Absolutely. Last question here before we go to the Q&A. We get to have a vision and share some hope here. So let's pretend it's 20 years into the future and we've achieved success in the disability sector. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Paint me a picture. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go first. That's a really cool question. So I am a member of the Labor Party, so it's pretty obvious what I care about. I care about people having a job. It's in our name. We are the Labor Party. And for me, a job provides dignity. And if you want to work, you should be given that opportunity too. And it does link into education, because you need to have the right to go through school as well to be able to get into the workforce. But for me, it would just be knowing that we can change that ratio and those horrible statistics about people being less likely to get into the workforce. 3 times less likely if you're autistic to be employed if you have than any other disability, and 8 times more likely to be unemployed if you're autistic than a non-autistic person. That needs to change. There is so many skill sets and value to be going into the workforce from the autistic community, and we need to figure out how we can really change that outcome. Because, as I said, to be able to get dressed in the morning, to open your door and go out to work, it's a really, really important thing, and it provides that dignity for so many other things. It goes into the messaging about mental health. It goes into the messaging about many other co-occurring diagnoses as well. So if we can get people into the workforce, that would be my great dream.
Fantastic. Dignity and purpose I'm hearing there. Josephine.
For me, it really would be having more lived experience. So that means that there are disabled people that are in the upper echelons of NDIS that are leading programs that are by disabled people for disabled people. And so if we provide the right supports and services early so that disabled individuals can fulfil those positions and have lived experience in teaching, in medical professionals, GPs, psychiatrists, everybody, because that's where the true authenticity comes out, and understanding of what disabled people need. So for me, that would be really the ultimate outcome in terms of having disabled people leading work for disabled people.
Yeah, perfect. Lived experience. I think Minister Shorten's also done some work with Kurt recently in that space as far as leadership. Over to you, Bill.
Well, we haven't just appointed the first person with a disability to chair the NDIS, Kurt Fernley, but in 20 years I don't want that to be extraordinary. It's not just the Minister for the NDS should be a person with a disability, but there should be more politicians with disabilities. There should be more leaders. You could see newsreaders with disability. You could see on our media. But for me, 20 years' time, I went to the Beijing Paralympics in 2008. And it was very interesting for me then to see that for 10, 12 or 14 days, disability was not remarkable. It was just part of the landscape. The buildings were designed which were accessible. There were people from all countries and of all nationalities, ethnicities and faiths. And you didn't look at the disability, you wondered what event they were in. What were they going to do? So for me in 20 years' time, I want, if a child is developmental delay is detected and screened, that they can get access. When they go to school, they're not segregated and treated in a way which is second class. That when they get vocational education, it's thought about from year 7, not as an afterthought in year 12. That when they go to university or TAFE, that the universities and TAFEs absorb them and it's not exceptional. That when they catch a bus, they can get access. When they're on a tram, that when they want to get their wheelchair, they don't have to fill in 1 million reports. If they need a guide dog or an assistance dog, it's not argued about. That, but also for the people who work in disability in 20 years' time. I want to see teachers in special schools, if we still have them, to be paid 6-figure sums. That disability aids in the mainstream system are regarded as, well-paid career professionals, not add-ons. It's that for disability carers, that you're not getting paid $29 an hour. that people can think about a career and working in disability. Most of all, as a pet thing of mine, that for parents who are now 60, who wonder what's going to happen to their adult child, that when they're 80, they've got an answer. And it's a good promise. It's a promise of hope.
Fantastic. We've got our first question down here. So what is being done to address the over-reliance on allied health services in the pricing arrangements, especially given the skill shortage across the nation? Assuming maybe Minister Shorten.
Oh, pricing is one of the, the black box, which they keep the airplane data in. I think pricing for the NDIS is a bit of a black box matter. No one sees it. I'm sure I agree with that. The point, I didn't quite hear it, but the point is, I think we should have more transparent pricing before we get to the issue of just allied health professionals. It's got to be fair. You've got to make a living out of it. We've also got to make sure that it's consistent with other approaches across industry. So I'm not sure I fully grasp where the question's going. I get the skills shortage issue, but pricing needs to be a lot more transparent in the NDIS, because that way people can make long-term business decisions about investment in the sector.
Any other comments from across the panel?
Well, I'm not too sure about the pricing side of things, but in regards to accessibility to see an allied health professional, I guess that's where I can look at it from this perspective, is it is hard to get in to see someone, and there is a long wait list, and for a lot of people, going through the private sector isn't an option. So, the government is looking at spaces where we can provide that support and investments through providers like Autism SA and other Women's and Children's Hospital. But, there is more that to make it accessible that is important as well, that we do look at what we can do. But that goes back to taking that into our schools. So that extra 100 allied health professionals are going into our schools to be able to provide that support there, so it is accessible to people. I realise that doesn't cover the whole community, but it is also supporting that early diagnosis, and getting that earlier is important. So that's why we are doing it there. It comes from primary school to secondary school. So you can have an OT, speech pathologist or a psychologist and get access to that in school.
Fantastic. Any comment there at all, Josephine?
Just very briefly, this is more of a Medicare issue than an NDIS issue, but for psychologists, getting rid of the two-tiered system whereby clinical psychologists have a bigger rebate than all us other psychologists, and so that is creating a bottleneck whereby individuals can't access psychological services because of it's not affordable. So that's a really simple thing, for example, you can do in psychology.
Fantastic. I think we've got our last question here. How will accountability be addressed when it comes to NDIS representatives? There seems to be a lot of pressure placed on provider accountability.
I think that question means for the agency itself. How will the organisation administering the NDIS be accountable? Well, I think we'll do it through a very proactive board. We'll do it through active engagement with the states and territories. We're meeting every 6 weeks. Nat does a great job from South Australia. I think even more fundamentally, I want to maintain a much more transparent and consistent relationship between decision makers in the NDIS and participants. Co-design's how we achieve that. I think too much of what's happened in the past and recent years at the NDIA is representatives in the disability world are brought into the NDIA and they are presented with essentially a fait accompli and said, this is what we're going to do, what do you think? So I hear a lot from people who've been dealing with the NDIS that consultation has been more lip service than real, and that there's no proper co-design. What we need to do in the NDIS, in my opinion, is that if people come up with an idea and participants or the disability sector don't agree, then the idea doesn't go forward. Because unless it's genuine partnership and equal decision making, instead of a sort of paternalistic relationship, there can't be true trust. One thing I will say to you about accountability is that we're picking a couple of hard issues right now. At the time of the May election, there were 4,500 people in the courts arguing with the NDIA about their plans. We're really blitzing the list of those legacy cases, but we've got oversight from people with disability, a committee chaired by Graham Innes, the former Human Rights Commission. We've now resolved 1,800 of those matters. That's not enough, but that's 1,800 people not going through the trauma of multiple issues in the AAT. Another form of trust and accountability is hospitals. There's people who are medically fit for discharge from hospital who are eligible to be on the NDIS or state programs for disability, and they're still waiting. And that's disastrous for that person. It's not a great use of scarce hospital resources. I know that we've literally got hundreds of people out of hospital now by putting extra resources in to speed up the process, and I know Nat in South Australia has been a great leader of that from the States. So the point of me telling you those two stories about accountability, other than revitalising the board and the leadership, is if I want you to trust the NDIS, we have to be trusted. And the only way that I get your trust is by doing acts of trust. And that way you might believe me on other things I say if I do the things which I've said I'm going to do. And that's why we've picked the legacy court lists and better alternative dispute resolution when there is an argument, and going after this issue of hospital discharge as a start. Because if we actually say we're going to do something which is important to people, we do it in co-design with people with disability, and then we accomplish it, it turns around a sense of distrust into a sense of maybe things are getting better.
Fantastic. In the essence of time, I think we might wrap it there. We'll put our hands together for our panel here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Real pleasure.
Thank you, Trevor, and I'm sure I speak for many people in the room. What was fantastic about that discussion was the level of trust, with Mr Shorten speaking about that at the end, the level of trust and being able to hear a federal minister speak openly, and I think as honestly as you could possibly imagine, in a room where everyone will go out and take their opinions and get on their socials and do whatever. It's fantastic to hear a politician actually talking about how to win back trust. In my work, what I hear a lot and what I see in evidence all the time is that there is a complete disconnect, it seems to me, in our modern world between leadership, trust and expectation. What people expect from their leaders and what they feel they get from their leaders leads them not to trust the process. So thank you, Mr Shorten, for being so forthcoming with your comments today. Fantastic to hear about the world-leading work of Dr Josephine Babaro, and those statistics are remarkable. They boggle my mind that someone can devise a tool that gives parents the opportunity to work with their children and to gain everything from their children that is possible because they understand how their child is learning and engaging with the world. So that's an amazing piece of research, and I'm sure, Josephine, that your work will be taken up across the world. So congratulations on that. And of course, we also had the benefit of hearing from Emily Burke, our newly minted is the word I'm looking for, Assistant Minister for Autism, and that is indeed a great step forward again for parents and for the social fabric of South Australia, and a brave move, one I wish you all strength with, Emily. It won't be an easy one to achieve, but let's hope that that is a model that's adopted across Australia. And on the topic of disability becoming more visible, never assume, Mr Shorten, that there aren't newsreaders with disabilities. We just keep them well hidden. And isn't that a tragedy in its own right? That those of us who have issues that might affect our lives and influence our day-to-day activities, that we feel obliged to keep them from the public. That's a whole other topic for discussion around stigma. We won't go there just at the moment. On a final note, though, I must say it was deeply disturbing to me. It was really uplifting to hear the Minister Shorten have some suggestions about how he sees the next 20 years. I was speaking to Professor Barbaro before we began today and saying that one of my very first public forum facilitations when I was a young much younger journalist, about 30 years ago, was in this city to facilitate a community meeting with families of people with disability, and to hear a story about a woman in her 80s at that time, this is 30 odd years ago, whose only means of getting out of the house to do what at that stage, there was no internet, no social media, she had to do her banking, her grocery shopping and all those sorts of the pharmacy visits, all the things we used to have to do in person. And the only way she could get out of the house was to tie her mature age disabled son to a chair to keep him safe while she went out for a couple of hours to do her job. And she wasn't able to attend the meeting, but her neighbour came on her behalf and put that to the community as to how could we make that better. What alarms me as a journalist and as an observer and as a member of a great Australian community here in South Australia is that I suspect there are still 70 and 80-year-olds facing that situation with their adult children. And I would hope that all of us in our community, whether we're in the allied health professions, whether we're in the medical system, whether we're community members who have no entree into those worlds, that somehow over the next 20 years, for God's sake, that becomes a piece of history. And I challenge all of us to make sure that's the case, because I fear that it's not. Bill Shorten's vision for that to be an eradicated issue is one that I share, and I'm sure all of you in this room do too. Now, we're about to be served dessert. That's the conclusion of the formal part of today, but I'm sure you've had much food for thought given to you from our speakers. I'm sure you want to network extensively amongst yourselves. Can I just say in closing the formal part of the afternoon that our very generous host, Trevor Keen, has, I hope this doesn't cause a riot, but if you could consensually amongst yourselves and with a degree of conviviality decide who amongst each table would like to take the flower centrepieces home, you may, as a gift from Trevor Keen, but please, no fighting and no throwing flowers or vases. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, you're about to have dessert. Thank you so much. Yes, grabbing early is not an option either. You do have to have conversation. It's been terrific to see so many committed individuals in the room listening as one to the conversation. I'm sure it'll create many more conversations in your workplaces, and they, of course, are imperative if we are to solve the many, many dilemmas that are faced within our health sector at the moment. But on the upside, there is no other country with an NDIS, and it is a great tribute to Mr. Shorten and his tenacity, his perseverance, and I suspect a lot of very late nights thinking about it. But it is wonderful that this country has an NDIS, and I'm sure you will all go forth and work hard to make sure that it works better for our country. So thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your attendance today. Enjoy your desserts. Good afternoon.
Wow, what an action-packed panel that was. There were so many fantastic topics that we covered. I'm going to do a quick summary just to make sure that you got all that value, and you can certainly go back and re-watch or listen if you want at a later time. Particularly the SACS model by Josephine Babaro, 81% effectiveness versus 6%, which was the next best. So that's the world's best screening tool, which is fantastic that we've got that here in Australia. How well early intervention is going is also discussed, and we very much talk about autism inclusion teachers and training our educators. Emily Burke really led that conversation there, and we look forward to speaking to her more in the future and finding out more about that. Also about where does mental health fit in? Is it under NDIS? Is it disability, education or health? Who takes responsibility on that? We covered through strengths-based approach versus deficit model, which currently does exist, so it's very much a deficit-based currently. Behaviours are concerned, so the lack of education for teachers leading towards school refusal and having many issues there. Then it was fantastic to open up and hear each individual person's 20-year vision for the future. What does it look like? It was fantastic. I'll get a little snippet up for other people to listen to that at a later time. Pricing, is it going up or down? And AAT, so in regards to those reviews that are going through, getting a lot more of those that are succinctly getting wrapped up, and also hospital length of stay and accountability, what that looks like into the future. That does bring today's episode to an end. I hope you did find it educational and learnt something from it. As fellow Aussies, you know there's nothing worse than being stingy. So if you did get value from today's episode, please do share this with someone that you know, whether that's a participant, support coordinator, or family member. Please do pass it along. As Jane Doyle was saying, it's fantastic to be able to follow up, and we're going to have an exclusive 101 with Josephine Babaro and learn more in regards to the great tools that she has developed. So do stay tuned in regards to that. As always, if you've got any feedback for me, please do get in touch via email. Likewise, if you've after some allied health services, get in touch with us at Conscious Healthcare SA. The details you'll need will be in the show notes. Apart from that, we'll leave you to it. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for your listening.